Welcome to the Germinate Podcast, where agriculture, business, and innovation take root and thrive. I'm Joe Sampson, and with nearly 2 decades of experience in agricultural equipment and scaling businesses, I'm here to bring you actionable insights, inspiring stories, and strategic advice. Whether you're an industry veteran or just starting out, this podcast is your guide to cultivating ideas, expanding your knowledge, and growing your venture. So let's get started and germinate your path to success. All right, welcome back to the Germinate Podcast. I guess this one's about the power of relationships with me and Mr. David Thompson with he's with Stine Seed. He's the national marketing sales director, and David and I think we probably met through your dad, but the power of LinkedIn as well. But I used to work with your dad, Roger, for a lot of years back in my previous employer. So welcome aboard, David. Thanks for being here.
Hey, glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Well, yeah. So people see Stine on your shirt, and I guess really probably everybody knows that name. And I'm just going to lead off here with a quick little story. So I traveled for a lot of years back at my previous employer. One time I'm sitting in a bar in Germany. Okay. We go to the AgriTechnica show in Hanover. I don't know if you've been there or not, but we went there for many years in a row. So I'm sitting in a bar in Germany. Next to me, it's like the greatest place in the world to be, because there could be somebody from Finland, a guy from Spain, another American, somebody from Canada, somebody from Mexico, all at the same bar. You know, it's like the opening to a joke. But I'm sitting there, I'm having a couple beers, and there's 2 Israeli guys next to me, and they start asking me questions, and I'm like, yeah, I'm from America. And then they're like, well, where in America? And I'm like, well, Iowa, but you probably never heard of it. And they're like, Harry Stine. I'm like, yeah, Harry Stine. He's this, he's this legend that these 2 guys in Israel knew, because that's what Harry Stine sort of represents in our state for sure. He's like one of these. He's a living legend for sure, but he gets spoken with the likes of the Elon Musks and Jeff Bezos, and I mean, real icons, not only in Iowa but also the world. I mean, he's got a B behind his name, if you know what I mean. And it's funny, I've met Harry a couple of times and nobody would ever know that. So I guess I lead off with that story to welcome David on board and say, man, what is that like to hear probably a story like that every day when you work at Stine Seed? What an opening question.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing, and maybe to give a little bit of background as well. So I grew up right here, right in the area where Stine Seed is, right in central Iowa. Went to school with Harry's kids, and so spent time on the farm when I was a boy. And in fact, walked beans for Stine when I was in high school. So for me, my journey started way a long time ago, and so I've kind of always known Harry from what I can remember, or Harry's at least known me since I was very young. And so that sort of influences some of my, perspective on that. But as I've gone on in my career, you do start to understand, the how large of a shadow he casts, certainly in the seed business, and then within agriculture, and then just as you said, just even globally. He is, known to many folks, and like I said, probably wasn't familiar to me until until I'd been with the company for a while.
Yeah.
I remember in 2014, I had a call from an editor of Forbes magazine, and he said, I've been reading about Harry and I'd like to come and spend some time with him. And at that moment, it was kind of like, wow, that's a little different.
Yeah.
And so he came out and he wrote a really nice article in 2014 about Harry and somewhat about his past and his accomplishments, but also about his legacy and where he sees his legacy going in the future. And so anyway, things like that lend new perspective, right, to that. And you go, wow, okay, this guy's really well known. And certainly more so within our own industry, which is the seed business.
Sure.
But everywhere we go, farmers associate the name Stine with our genetics, corn and soybean genetics, and many of them associate us with Harry himself as a, private, entity, as a farmer first,
Sure.
but certainly as a successful business person.
Yeah. And I think, if for those of you that have had the pleasure to meet Harry, he's one of those guys that you'd have no idea that he kind of is as influential as he is. And I liken it to a lot of some of the names that I mentioned before, where they have this fantastic idea and this brilliant mind, and they would do this whether or not they made a dollar or not. And that's kind of the way I think maybe Harry is. And you could probably tell me differently, but I think he just has a passion for this and has a great genius mind for this. And the residual effect is, yeah, you can make a lot of money too, but that's not the real reason why he's in business. And I'm guessing that resonates throughout the entire company and corporation, correct?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think in this day and age, the term "thinking outside the box" is almost a cliche,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But I think one of the hallmarks of Harry is his ability to push boundaries and kind of, push everyone to think bigger,
Hmm.
and to seek out new solutions if we think the best one hasn't been created yet. Um, I think that comes from his just natural curiosity. He has a mind for research,
Hmm.
and so a lot of that is reflected in all different aspects of our organization. The funny thing about research is, we kind of kiddingly say 99% of what we do is mistakes. It's the
Yeah.
1% that pays for everything else. And so a lot of our culture is built around that idea that we're not going to be afraid to try new things and take new directions and to innovate, because that's the only way you move forward. Um, Kind of, a couple other things, years ago, I don't know if you remember when Facebook came out with their IPO, there were some interesting things in their filings. And one of the comments was sort of this mantra they had, which is move fast and break things.
Yeah.
As sort of their corporate, sort of philosophy.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that kind of describes the work that we do. I mean, in many cases, in many facets of our organization, we're a strong believer in version 1.0. Like don't get it. It doesn't have to be perfect right out of the gate. Let's
Yeah.
get it going and let's evolve it and make it better. And there's always an opportunity to make something better over time.
Yeah.
So that it makes the journey unique, I think, in our aspect, and it makes it challenging and interesting.
Yeah. I'm reading Elon's. It's a book about Elon. I want to say Isaacson is the author. I can't remember, but it's a big long book. But in there they talk about the SpaceX journey and how it was basically SpaceX and Tesla in the 2000s, and he had three failed launches before finally launch four was a success, and then they got all sorts of money from NASA and all these other organizations. But I think the point resonates where you can't be afraid to take a risk in today's world. It seems like we're getting very scared to just jump off that cliff and go for it. To your point, you said version 1.0 is okay, but we can have a version 2 or a 3 or a 4 or a 25. It doesn't really matter. So I think that philosophy works, and obviously we see it in guys like Elon and guys like Harry Stine. I mean, don't be afraid of it is the point, right?
Yep. 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 Exactly. And I think again, over the years, it served us well. And obviously we have different facets to our business. Most of my time is spent on what we call the branded business. So we sell
Okay.
corn and soybean seed to farmers under the Stine label, and that's a, a majority of the work that I do. But we have other companies that do that create corn genetics, soybean genetics. We do biotech. All those things find their way into our products or into other products. But all of those, I think, have been made stronger by having this very, sort of open source philosophy and sort of almost like don't overthink it kind of approach.
Right.
Let's just keep moving forward and keep improving the product. And and that also lends itself to, we are a, no, I'm saying we are a product driven company,
Sure.
much more so than a marketing driven company. When what I mean by that is, we will have products coming through the pipe every year. We'll evaluate 1 million different soybean lines every year,
Yep.
which means every year we have new, better lines that are coming behind it. As a result, we will drop products from our lineup, very quickly because we have something newer and better.
Yeah.
And I say we live by the sword, die by the sword on the product side, because it doesn't matter if it's the best selling product we currently have. It doesn't matter if it's got the best name recognition of any product we have out in the market. If we have something that's 3% better, that one's out the door.
Yep. Here we
On to the
go.
next thing.
That's super intelligent, though. I love that. Don't be afraid to trim the fat either. And if you got a better version, let it rip. Uh,
Yep.
why don't you give everybody kind of a lesson in genetics over the course of the last is a kind of a high level view of genetics over the last 10, 15, 20 years, kind of where it was, and then maybe where it is today.
Well, so again, we specialize in corn and soybeans, and so those are the crops that we have chosen to work with. And we have our own breeding entities, so we do corn breeding and soybean breeding
Mm-hmm.
that ultimately finds its way into seed products. And those started back in the '60s. Actually, that's where really Harry got his start in the '60s, breeding and developing new soybean lines. And at that time, the only people that were doing that were universities. Really, for all intents and purposes, there was no private entity doing soybean breeding.
And he was just doing
Um,
it on his own. He was just
right. So
okay. Okay.
So he took some classes at Iowa State, and he got together with a couple of other seeds people here in the area around Iowa, and they formed a company called Improved Variety Research, and that was really the first private breeding entity. And he would tell you, we didn't know any better. I mean, at that time, you know there was no way to protect your intellectual property
Right.
on a soybean. um, so many people are like, you don't want to get into that because it's probably not going to be that profitable.
You'll just get
But
copied or whatever. Yeah.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
exactly. But he
Yeah.
chose to get involved, and his system worked so well that pretty soon they were really kind of blowing the doors off everything that was coming out of the universities. So they were licensing genetics to a lot of seed companies that were starting to sell soybeans.
Hmm.
And then in 1979, they were doing well enough. He said, "Well, I really ought to sell my own brand since everything we have is doing so
Right.
well." So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
what that was the sort of motivation for Stine brand being started. The brand actually began in 1979, but he had started the breeding program a little more than a decade before that.
Okay.
So we have a long history, certainly on the soybean side for sure, and almost as much on the corn side, of what I would call conventional seed breeding. Right. So that's crossing product, line A by line B to come up with a new product. That's really at our core. That's what we're about, is creating brand new genetics that the world has never seen before. And then trying to evaluate those and make sure that they do what we want them to do, which is provide a better yield than anything we have in our lineup today. And so that's really what drives the program. So we've had corn breeding programs, soybean breeding programs since the late '60s and the early '70s. Then in our industry, and really, our programs continue to be extremely strong. I mean, we have a huge licensing business that we really are on the soybean side. Certainly, the kind of the engine that supports the soybean seed business at this
Right.
point, and that continues to be true. The kind of thing that changed the game in the seed business was biotechnology. Biotechnology in the 1990s, it started to become clear that biotechnology was going to play a role in the row crop seed business. And so once again, Harry had the foresight to see this, and in the early '90s, established a biotech facility in Ames, Iowa. So we have a dedicated facility called Stine Biotechnology up in Ames, and their task was to work on developing their own method of transforming plants. In other words, inserting genes into plants.
Mm,
Because at that time there were only really about three methods that you could use to insert genes, and of course those were either owned by competitors or
okay.
they had certain patents around them. And so the problem with that is you may be able to approach that company and say, hey, we have this novel trait, for whatever, let's say cold tolerance in soybean, and we'd like to insert it into a plant, and we need a transformation method to do it. Well, that company may look at your proposal and say, well, that looks like it might hurt our business.
Right.
So no, we don't think we want you to use
I see.
our
Yeah.
transformation method.
Yeah.
So that's why it was so important to start that lab and to work on developing a system of plant transformation that we would possess, that we would own. And they did that. So in the late 90s, we developed called the aerosol beam injector, as a new method of plant transformation. So that one gives us freedom to operate. That's really important, so that we can work collaboratively with other companies, or we can use our own transformation system. So along that same time, in the mid 90s, 1996, we started to see the Roundup Ready soybeans, and then eventually Roundup Ready corn come to market. And those were the first biotech developed corn and soybean products to hit the market. And of course, within a matter of just a few years, they really commanded the lion's share of the corn and soybean
Those were
market.
game changers when they
They
came
were.
out. Yeah,
They
exactly.
were, because again, when I was young, I remember we'd ride the bean bar to spray weeds, and Grandpa would put Roundup in, and he'd say, "Don't hit a bean, because that's
Right.
going to kill that bean." Well,
Right.
Roundup Ready changed that, and
Yeah.
it really changed the game. And so after that came several other innovations, and today the trait business is certainly almost as important as the genetics part of the equation. And, arguably in some crops, it might be more important. It might be the lion's share of the value. So today, what we look at is we count ourselves fortunate that we have both of the pieces of the puzzle that are so important in this corn and soybean business. We have this big pool of germplasm, genetic material that we can breed with and continue to make new and better lines. And then over here, we have our own biotech resources, our own biotechnology, and we have some traits that we actually have ownership of. And so now we can go to market with these traits, and that's how you remain relevant, and that's how you remain, how you have a place in the industry. Because if you don't have access to good genetics, and you don't have good access to the traits that are in play, it's a tough row to hoe.
Yeah. And I think along the lines of manufacturing, it's vertical integration, more or less, is what you're saying at its finest. And for those that are in manufacturing, the lesson is, it's always valuable to make the products you make more efficiently. And that's sort of what you're talking about here. Like, control as much of it as you possibly can, because when you start relying on a bunch of outside services, uh, number one, you can lose efficiencies that way. But number two is, to your point, there could be some imbalances, and you're in a sense buying from competitors, and who's getting a priority. And so it sounds like you guys just said, you know what, we're going to take control of this and do as much vertical integration as we possibly can here.
Yeah, yeah, and so one thing is you kind of become, like you said, you're vertically integrated, you improve your efficiency. The other thing, to draw a finer point, is, I think the saying would be, if you're not, if you're going into, we work very collaboratively with a lot of other companies in our
Sure.
sector.
Sure.
And so that involves a lot of negotiations. We work with our family of companies works with companies that, for me on the branded side, are my direct competitors at times. We do battle on the field,
That's
but behind the
interesting, isn't
scenes,
it?
we
Yeah.
work collaboratively with them. And I guess my point is, the other thing I would say is if you don't do the things that we've done, bottom line, if you aren't negotiating from a position of strength, you're probably not really negotiating. You're just taking what they'll give you, right? So by having set ourselves up in this way, we can say, listen, you have good stuff, we have good stuff, let's work together. Now, if you're not going to play fair and you don't want to work with us, that's fine. We'll just do our stuff because we know what we have, right? And that keeps everybody honest in a way.
Well, and to your point, that's a position of strength right there. I love that. It's an intelligent way to go about, um, you know, not only making your business successful, but also giving you a path to a future that can be successful as well. So, yeah, man, I love that. Talk about Roundup glyphosate. It's a hot topic these days, and I don't know how much you want to talk about, but to your point, Roundup Ready stuff changed the game back in the when was that? You said the 90s.
Yeah. So Roundup Ready soybeans came out in '96. Roundup Ready corn would have been probably a couple years after, I think 98 or 99, when we started to see Roundup Ready corn come to market.
So we're talking 20, 25, 30 years here of Roundup Ready and game changer. Yields were through the roof. I mean, it made the life of a farmer so much easier. And now, really, I don't. There's probably more than two things, but the two things I think about as the dumb guy in the room here. Number one is some of these weeds are starting to be resistant to Roundup anyway. I mean, I notice it sometimes in my own yard. It's like, man, Roundup's not doing what Roundup used to be able to do. What the heck? And then number two, and maybe the more important one, is Roundup has this awful reputation now of it's giving everybody cancer and it's the worst thing you could ever do. And so, you know, what's the next way to kind of engineer ourselves out of this whole using too much Roundup? And this might be controversial, I don't know, but is that a pretty fair point on those two things, or is there more?
So I mean, a couple comments. One, you know, uh, weed resistance or weeds developing resistance to herbicides is not a new thing. It has happened before. It will happen again. And the problem you have, I had a weed specialist one time who said to me, applying the exact same herbicide in about 30 different consecutive applications on a weed population is the perfect recipe for developing resistant weeds, right? So
Interesting.
if you hit it with the same thing over and over and over again, you will eventually find a population that it may suffer, but it lives. And it lives long enough to create seed. And now all of a sudden you have a population of resistant weed. And so that's what happened with Roundup. Roundup Ready came to market. Like you said, it was a game changer. It really drove efficiency on the farm. And a lot of farmers went to Roundup Ready soybeans and Roundup Ready corn, and they were just spraying Roundup after Roundup after Roundup.
Yeah, just
And
hammering it. Just
just
let it rip.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and like you said, and in the early days it worked amazing because and so then after a while, nature finds a way, right? And so that's ultimately what happened. And we now know, like I said, this is common knowledge. And so a lot of what we talk about in our business is integrated weed management. Is you have to, if you want to protect a technology like any sort of herbicide technology, the key is to treat it. You have to not overuse it. So we talk a lot about tank mix. You use two different herbicides. Hitting the weed with two different modes of action is an important consideration because it dramatically, exponentially reduces the risk of weeds developing resistance. Things like spraying pre-emerge, in other words, before that weed ever gets out of the ground. The best time to kill a weed is before it ever becomes a weed.
Right.
That's
Right.
better yet.
Yeah.
So we learned a lot
Hmm.
from the early days of Roundup Ready technology, and that informed a lot of what has come since in the other, the herbicide. There's been three, four different herbicide technologies since then,
Sure.
and so now the understanding is, hey, there has to be a comprehensive approach if we want this to last. The other thing that happened uh, with around Roundup Ready was Roundup Ready, like you said, was the shot heard around the world. And it
Right.
was such a massive change that funding into new herbicide modes of action almost evaporated overnight,
Interesting.
at least as it relates to corn and soybean, row crop.
Hey, folks, let's pause the podcast for a second to talk about one of the companies making the Germinate podcast possible. Want to give a huge thanks to GBGI. Here's Mark Adams.
Thanks, Joe. At our shop in Chardon, Ohio, every part we build is made with precision. From the CNC machining to the final inspection, we don't rush because we know your customers can't afford failure. If you're a dealer or OEM who wants reliability built in, give us a look. GBGI, built to spec, built to last. Learn more at gbgiusa.com. GBGI, grow with us.
Why do you think it's just because they figured out that they had this perfect, they thought they had this perfect genetic and it was like, okay, nothing can ever top that. Why are we even thinking about it? Just, we've got it. We figured it out. Yeah. Yeah.
That's right. That's
I
right.
got you.
And so you sort of have this gap where for a period of time, there was really no strong investment in new modes of action. Right now, the youngest herbicide on the market that we have for corn and soybeans was in 1997. That's when it came out.
Is that right?
And so what we've had to do in our field is recombine different technologies, so that to again create these packages that will extend the utility of existing technologies. So that's what we've been doing. So you see these, most of the traits you see come out today offer tolerance to 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 different herbicides to give the grower flexibility so they can apply more than one in one application and hopefully keep those technologies intact for the future. So that's how it relates, is for weed resistance. Now, as you said, Roundup right now is under a lot of challenge. With the lawsuits, and where that goes, we'll have to see. But it's a challenge for the industry. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to speak to whether how much of this is accurate, how much is not accurate.
Right.
But we can't just start to mandate these technologies out of existence, because there is millions and millions and millions of acres of crop that rely on these technologies. And to close the door to those, whether it's herbicide or whether it's anhydrous ammonia or any of these things, it requires a fairly comprehensive solution. Otherwise, I don't think we're ready for the shock that the system will take when we start wholesale mandating some of those things.
Well, and when I think about it too, I think it just in the state of Iowa, which is where both you and I are currently residing, and probably me, I'll always reside in. Um, I read a stat, whether or not this is true, because it came from Google or maybe Chat GPT. I can't remember where, but I think it said 97% of the land in Iowa is agricultural land. That seems like a high number, but it's probably a higher number than you think. And of that, 80% of farmers in Iowa are family farms. So these guys and gals have a farm, a business to take care of, to manage, to live off of. I mean, this is a big part. This is their livelihood. They don't know any other way. So the only way to make money as a farmer, unless there's other ways, but the only way I think to make money from a farmer is to put your crop in the ground, let it grow, and then sell your crop. And if you have a crappy crop, you're not going to make any money on it because it costs a certain amount of money to put the thing in the ground. So, to your point, if we start mandating ourselves out of some of these technologies, we're going to take away the livelihood of a lot of farmers, and it's a challenging issue because it's going to take guys like you all at Stine to come up with something that's going to maybe a happy medium here. And so I'm sort of in the middle on the issue. Is it true that we probably dumped way too much Roundup on this stuff back in the 90s and 2000s? Yes. But does that mean we eliminate it altogether? I don't think that's the answer either. And maybe I'm
Yeah.
soapboxing here, but
Yep.
go ahead.
Yep. And the other thing about that is there's a couple ways to look. Right now, a lot of the glyphosate lawsuits that are in play are revolving around long-term exposure to
Okay.
the chemical itself, right? So somebody who over a period of decades and decades applied it, mixed it, was in close contact with the chemical. So that's one potential, audience, right? And then there's this other audience that also worries about, the impact of herbicide or fertilizer on our food crops in general. And so, to me, on that side of things, when I'm talking to those groups, I always try to remind them, farmers, a couple things. One, farmers rely on the land for their living. Anything they do that diminishes the value or the productivity of that land ultimately is going to destroy them in the long term.
Right.
So they have a vested interest in doing the right thing and doing it the right way. So that's important for us to understand. Second thing is, I always try to remind them, the farming community doesn't have a secret stash of food, that they keep separate for themselves, that's free of herbicides and free of, they're
Right.
eating and drinking the same things that everyone is.
Of
So
course.
the idea is the idea that somehow, because you hear people say, well, we're poisoning everybody. Well, that seems counterintuitive to my mindset, that we're that somehow we have people who would be setting out to poison themselves actively. So the only rational explanation to that would be, well, they just don't understand. They don't know that that's happening. But there's been a lot of research. One of the best is there's a research called the Trillion Meal Study that was really, really cool. I can't remember which university did it, but they took a bunch of data from the 20 or 30 years prior to Roundup Ready soybeans being released, and then took the same window of data from the post period and said, okay, let's look at livestock, because livestock is generally who's being fed these corn and soybeans. So, if there's a problem with, let's say, we call them GMOs, right? If there's a problem with GMO, the first place we'll find it is in livestock. We'll
Of
see
course.
livestock mortality increase. And so they compared the 30 years prior to 1996 and the 30 years after. And guess what? There was absolutely no
No
difference.
change. No change
So
whatsoever.
now, does that mean that's the end of the story? Well, maybe, maybe not. But certainly it would tend to indicate that there's been no significant rise in mortality among livestock. So the food supply doesn't seem like it's drastically being altered at any point so far.
Well, you know what it's like in the world we live in, man. When we were kids, it was good to have bread and carbs and eat whole grains, and now all of a sudden that stuff's bad for you. And now this trend's popular and that trend's popular. So, I think the obvious answer is, don't eat Doritos and drink 72 ounces of Coca-Cola every day, folks. That might help you. Maybe get a walk in every now and again, but um, I don't know. It's a little overdrawn here, but
Yeah. So to close up your question, I mean, the glyphosate, sort of perception right now is concerning for all parties. I mean, obviously, we've got people who've had issues, and we want to make sure that justice is had. At the same time, I think agriculture, we sit here and say, well, again, let's not just slam the door on this, because there has to be alternatives. There has to be other ways to in place for farmers to be able to grow a crop.
well, and I think the most important thing to think about during this whole debate, and it is an issue for sure, but some of the best ways to fix it and understand it are gonna be the guys that are in the guys and the gals in the industry. They're the ones thinking about it. They're the ones that have some of these innovative solutions. And that leads me to my next question with you is, clearly there's an ecosystem inside of agriculture. There's seed, there's chemical, there's the equipment side. Um, what's the relationship? I'm like, to your point, there's the chemical side. I'm guessing Stine gets their tentacles and involved with all these different kind of bifactors or sectors of agriculture, because everybody has to work with one another to make this thing work in the end, right?
Yeah. So, by the nature of what we do, yes, we get involved with a lot of other facets of production agriculture. Now,
Mm-hmm.
we are a little bit unique when you compare to, we have some, I'd say direct competitors in our industry who are large, multinational, global organizations, and
Sure.
they may have other aspects to their own business that are branch out into things like fertility and precision ag and even equipment and some of those things. So they are sort of integrated, whether vertically or laterally. We, for better or worse, just have chosen our path to focus on the genetic component of the seed. Now, because of the share of the market that we have, it gets us introduced to a lot of people in a
Of
lot of
course.
other sectors. And so we certainly have a lot of collaborative effort around, again, whether it's site specific technology, whether it's, fertilizer management as it relates, especially to corn and our high population corn. And then, some in the equipment business, particularly as it relates to planters and tractors.
Yeah. I mean, to your point, it is a collaboration. And, I don't know. Obviously, there's a lot of test plots in your location, and you guys are planting probably test sites, what, globally, all over the world, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you ever play around with things like more tillage, less tillage, different attachments on planters, this chemical versus that chemical, how much this sprayer over that sprayer, and different nozzles and drift and all that. There's so many different things involved with planting your genetic into the dirt, right?
Sure. Yeah. And so actually, Joe, I'd say we almost go the opposite route. And
Okay.
so our approach when it comes to breeding work is almost what I call tough love,
Okay.
right? Where we say, okay, the best genetics have to withstand whatever is going to be thrown at them. So for example, when we do soybean plots are done on farmer fields. So we contract with farmers in the areas that we want the trials to be done. We have them use the same tillage method they normally would use. They apply whatever fertility they normally would use.
Yep.
We don't require a special protocol. Um, and then they aren't treated, so we don't you apply seed treatment. The idea is to say we want to kind of present the worst case scenario,
Sure.
see how these products perform, and then if they perform really really well, we know that they can take on whatever. Now, to your point, after we have decided which one won the race,
Right.
and now that's the product that's going to advance, and probably 2 years from now it's going to become a commercial product. So now what we do is over the next couple of years, we need to use other resources. We have these product development plots, and we have other research that we do aimed at saying, okay, now let's focus and see where does this do. How does this do on no-till ground? How
Hmm.
does this do on black dirt? How does this do on sandy soil? To try to get a better, more specific placement of the product. But at the first cut, we are very literally looking at let's just only the strong survive. Let's see which one rises to the top. And the key to that is you've got to do it across a wide geography.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we will test across 50 different locations for soybeans. And we're looking for what we call widely adapted material. It means we don't want to say this product did well at this one location. We want to say this is the product that won across all the locations.
I see.
And that's the one that statistically is going to be best year after year after year.
Yeah. And so you're basically saying we're trying to take away you're trying to take away the variables because you can't control those, you know. Everybody's got a different practice on a different field in a different area of the world. I mean, some guys, a neighbor to neighbor, a row to row. So there's so many variables involved. And, you know, uh, things like how long is that piece of equipment going to last is a common question that a lot of growers ask. And it's like, well, how fast are you running? How deep's it going? Did you get a lot of rain this year? Is it really dry this year? What kind of soil do you have? So there's so many variables. So what you're saying is you can't control those. So we try to incorporate all those and say, hey, this works everywhere, right?
Right. And as you can imagine, that that idea
Mm-hmm.
seems deceptively simple,
Yeah.
right? So you can talk to growers. I talk to growers all from time to time, and they will say to me, I don't really care what your research says. All I trust is what happened uh, in the field across the road from my house.
Yeah. No kidding.
That's the test plot. So then I have to say, okay, so what you're telling me is you are more interested in one location in 1 year at that weather environment that happened that year versus my data, which is 50 locations, 2 years minimum or 3 years. Um, you see where this is going.
Of course.
Statistically, our data is going to show you what wins. Now, that doesn't mean you may luck out. You may plant this product that we said, hey, that's not the best product to pick. Well, maybe it has a good year, and maybe that year
Right.
that one wins and it's the best, and they say, well, you told me wrong.
Yeah.
Well, you won. But
Yeah.
what we're telling you is if you trust our data over the long haul, year in, year out, statistically, if you pick those winners, they're going to be the winners long term.
Yeah. And obviously I maybe you know this because your dad and I worked together for a long time, but I'm more familiar with the equipment side of things, and some of the conversations the equipment folks are having nowadays are really kind of blowing my mind. A lot of them are focusing on performance over volume. They realized during the COVID years that just pump out as much stuff as we can get out of here. It doesn't matter. Who cares? Just build it. Somebody's going to put it on a dealer lot. Somebody's going to buy it. Well, that caught up to us in a hurry. The fact that any of us thought that was sustainable, by the way, that's another podcast, but it's just somewhat ridiculous. But the reality of it is it wasn't sustainable. So now there's this glut of all this stuff out there. And so OEMs in equipment, whether it be tillage, planting, spraying, harvesting, even tractors, are trying to look at things in a totally different light. Like, how do I look at the performance of this piece of equipment over the volume of it? Meaning they're going to build a lot less equipment, but it's going to be as precision based, as filled with technology. Autonomous is coming. All these things are happening now. And so, how that relates to the seed is, well, it's always going to be planted at a certain depth. It's all, where there's some variables that might take place there as far as germination and all that. So I think it's interesting where this world is going. If that's true, which I think it makes sense if you're an equipment guy, hey, let's focus on making the best piece of equipment. It might be really expensive and it might last a long time, but it's going to be efficient for these guys. They're going to have to provide an ROI for it. And how that relates to seed is it hopefully will eliminate some of those variables.
Well, yeah, I think it helps. And I guess Joe, if you'll permit me to tell you a story here,
Of course.
we uh, had a slight foray into the equipment business about 10 years ago,
Okay.
and we are certainly not technology or we're not equipment people. But what happened is we were on the vanguard of a movement that's happening right now, currently in our industry around higher density planting population of corn. So corn population has grown over the last, 80, 90 years, but fairly slowly. But we began to see that there was a real advantage in pushing to higher densities in corn.
Let me
The
stop you real
problem,
quick. What do you mean by higher density?
sure, so higher planting population.
Okay.
So,
Okay.
so if you take, in the area where you and I live, in central Iowa, a farmer might plant, 30, as low as 34,000 seeds per acre, and maybe as high as 38,000 in 30-inch rows.
Okay. Got it.
We started to find these genetics that really, really started to maximize their potential at 44, 45, 48,000 plants per acre. Not that they were commercially available yet, but we started to see them in our research, and we said, this is where the industry needs to go, which is where farmers need to go.
Right.
Well, the problem becomes, you can talk about that all you want, but we also have to recognize that roughly 90% of the corn planted in the United States is in 30-inch rows.
Exactly.
And there is a practical limit to how much corn you can plant, what the population is you can plant in a 30-inch row. So, for example, a 30-inch row, if you get to 38,000 plants per acre, your plants within the row, that means your planter is dropping about every 5 inches. It's having to drop a seed.
Yep.
So now you got 30-inch a row, but within the row you got 5 inches, only 5 inches between them.
Right.
So we said, really, if you're going to do this, and the other thing we were seeing was this high population corn was tending to get shorter. So typically corn would be 12 to 14 feet tall, or maybe 10. We started to see corn coming out of our program that was 8, 7 feet tall.
Yeah.
And we said, that's not really ideal for a 30-inch row because you're trying to capture sunlight.
Of
And
course.
so we really need to try to maximize all the sunlight capture. So as we started to talk about this and we saw this coming, we realized this reaches a point where it bridges from just a conversation about seed, and really we start nudging growers about the cultural aspect of how they grow corn, right? We're going to have to ask them to change from 30-inch rows to 20-inch rows. And that's a whole different conversation when you're the
Right.
seed guy,
Of
right?
course.
So
It's a different planter. It's a different combine. It's different everything, right? I
Yep,
mean, that's it.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
So we ultimately ended up making contact with several planter companies,
Mm-hmm.
and we ended up forging a partnership with John Deere and Great Plains, who ultimately were interested in kind of going down this path with us. And basically, we decided to provide proof of concept. So what we did is we went to those companies and we contracted with them to build us roughly 100 20-inch planters.
Mm-hmm.
And those planters would be, we would purchase those planters as a Stine Seed company, and then we in turn would lease those to growers.
I got you.
So that for 2-year terms, so they could buy our corn, plant it according to how we want it planted,
Right.
and then prove to themselves that this whole system works. Well, for a company that has no business being in the equipment business, doesn't know anything about the equipment business, you can imagine it was not without its trials and tribulations.
I bet. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, we did move. We had 100 planters go out in the field, and we made a lot of customers look at their arrangement, and we also kind of set the industry on notice, I would say. So fast forward to today, higher population corn is becoming the norm.
Mm-hmm.
At least every company is talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think what we accomplished was we moved the needle forward and told growers, this is what you need to be thinking of. Oh, excuse me. And they just, so that's an example where, I think we had to really think outside the box and go, this is a bigger conversation than seed. And then as we were doing that, we had another company, German company by the name of Geringhoff, who makes harvester heads, had come to us and said, we're intrigued by your idea, and we're working on a harvester head a combine head to harvest corn, but we want it to be in any row width, any direction, a unidirectional corn head. And you guys sound like you'd be great to pair up with, try this out. So they came out to the farm one day and in our narrow row corn, and they picked some corn and they learned some things about their equipment. We had some that went well, some that wasn't, and they went back to the drawing board. And I think, within a couple of years, they came out with, I believe it was called the Patriot Series, which was really designed around the idea of being applicable to a lot of different ranges. So my point is, we're in the seed business, but you're right. You ultimately can start to influence some of these other aspects of agriculture if you're innovating enough.
Yeah, that's such an intelligent point, and I think it needs to be noted here to the equipment guys, to anybody in agriculture. You've got to just come up with the idea. If the idea is there, it will cross, not to use your term, but it'll cross pollinate with everybody else because you kind of have no choice but to jump on board. And if this twin row corn is the future, then things do need to change and evolve, and that's okay. We've been changing and evolving for a long time, and some ideas have worked, some ideas haven't, but I think the overarching goal is the grower in the family farm and the guy, the family sitting in Iowa, they're the ones that are going to win as a result of this. And that ecosystem can help benefit, all these movements and all these things that we're seeing. And, maybe there's a better way for 8-foot corn to be able to handle Roundup, for instance, to circle the conversation all the way back. Maybe there's all sorts of these unintended consequences that can just better the overall ecosystem of the farm.
And I think the learning went both ways. For us as a seed company, it helped us learn a lot, not only about our own material, but also about, again, the cultural practice of, how to plant. We are a working farmer operation, so we have
Of
a
course.
lot of experience in that. But
Of course.
to see it across the wider geography. Secondly, for these engineers who helped us with this project, I just remember some really fascinating things. One of our vendors, one of the planners, by the time we hung all the row units, because we had we had a 60-foot planter with 72 rows on it, and at that point their CAN bus wouldn't run that many rows
I bet.
in that arrangement. So that was a learning for them to say,
Yeah.
okay, we need more bandwidth. We need to do something different. In some cases, it got to the point where the row units themselves, because of how close together we're turning a third of the speed they do in a normal planter.
Of
So
course.
that in itself was another learning for that whole engineering team to go, okay, this is not something we've seen before.
Right.
So by innovating, like you said, you try a lot of things, you break things, you fix them, you come back and you do it again. And so over the years, we've been very fortunate. I think there are companies that have recognized that we're not afraid to break things
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
said, let's go to those guys. Let's try it out, and they'll put it to the test.
And I think it circles back to the start of this conversation is just don't be afraid to fail, don't be afraid to jump off that cliff and give it a try, because if you don't, you never know what you could come up with and who you could partner with. And there's so many people that are wanting to get on the cutting edge of and find the next thing. And Stine Seed's doing it, folks. And this has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I could go on for hours because it's just it feels like the future to me. It feels like let's start with this, and then how do we make everything kind of adapt to this? Now I could be way wrong, but it just feels like Stine is the future, and these kind of conversations are going to help. So I'm grateful for you, man. I'm glad we were able to do this and get this going. And I feel like we could talk for hours and hours, but you're at a conference there at the lake. We got to tout the Lake of the Ozarks. Good for you for being there, and a little conference that's about done, right? You're about out of there.
Yep, pretty soon. But yeah, no, we agriculture is a great community, and it's great to work in, and we can talk about it all day, every day. It's great people. It's a noble endeavor. So always enjoy visiting about it.
And if your dad's listening, I hope he will. Roger, I appreciate everything you've done for me, my friend. And You definitely were a mentor back in my day, for sure. Just helping me. I was just this young, naive kid and didn't know anything. I'm not young anymore. I still don't know anything, but I appreciate all the teaching and lessons. You're just one of the good guys. I'll always remember him, and he always talked about you. So I'm glad we finally connected. I think it was on LinkedIn, but I'm glad for this connection as well. So, how is your dad,
You
by the way?
You're doing good. You guys had a great group out there. I've been at Stine for 27 years and I love it. And I think that was the model for me. You guys had a great team there of folks who were there for the long pole, and that's kind of where I probably got my tendency to want to make a home somewhere and just be here. So always fun to catch up and see those folks and see that organization grow. But yeah, you're doing good, enjoying retirement. And
Good for
so
him.
things are
Good
good.
for him. Tell everybody how to get in touch with you, how to get in touch with Stine. If they want to learn more about you all.
Yeah, I mean, if they want to learn more about Stine as an organization, obviously our website, stineseed.com, covers a lot of our retail business and, kind of our product offerings and tells what we got going on. We have a blog there. If I can, I'll plug. We have a podcast called the Stine Seed Cast that I do that talks about seed industry related, generally about seed industry issues and as it relates to Stine. And so that's another place they can go for some more information.
Yeah, I forgot you're used to being on the other side of the microphone, so
Yeah,
I
that's kind of
appreciate.
weird.
Yeah, it is. I've been the guest on podcasts too, and it's like I don't know. I'd rather be the guy asking questions, but yeah, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. David Thompson, thanks for joining us, man.
Yep. Thanks. Appreciate it.
All right. Hey, folks, thanks for tuning into the Germinate Podcast. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with others in the industry. And join me next time as we continue to explore the innovations and strategies shaping the future of agriculture and business. Until then, keep growing, keep innovating, and keep germinating your success.